Hi, welcome to the Week 14 Forum. This week's topic, Homeland Security, addresses the efforts by nations to centralize their domestic counterterrorism policies, mostly starting in the early 2000s. For the United States, domestic counterterrorism really began in earnest in the aftermath of the 9/11, 2001 Al-Qaeda attacks. Prior to that, most of what the U.S. was doing was sort of ad hoc. It was sort of relentless ad hocism. Martin notes that similar traumatic terrorist attacks happened in Spain in 2004 and London in 2005. Martin also notes that the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013 these are examples where immigrants became radicalized and carried out very high-profile attacks, which galvanized the country into doing more to try and protect the homeland. This initial section is really interesting to me because I would have noted that one European country has kind of historically been far more advanced in counterterrorism, and that's because of the United Kingdom's long experience with fighting the Irish Republican Army. They engaged in a lot of really heavy-handed counterterrorism missteps, but they began recognizing that basic law enforcement techniques could be used, augmented by increased surveillance. Since the late 1990s, the UK has virtually put cameras in every inch of its public space. It's now the most heavily publicly surveilled industrialized country in the world. And I would note that Spain has also done a lot to, because of the Basque terrorist group. They have a long experience with domestic terrorism, and virtually every European country has had some sort of domestic terrorist problem. And then, of course, you would also note that Israel is probably the most militarized and the most intelligence-heavy country, again, owing to the threat that they face from encircling terrorist groups and hostile countries. So they're, again, kind of almost in a league of their own. Martin also discusses the threat posed, by Muslims living in Western European countries becoming radicalized and launching terrorist attacks. He cites the Paris attacks in 2015 and the 2016 terrorist attacks in Brussels, Belgium. These attacks highlighted the role that alienated Muslims played in these Francophone, countries. Muslims in French-speaking Europe have been far more poorly integrated than in Northern Europe. In France, for example, much of the Muslim populations have been isolated in what are called banlieues, which are basically suburbs in our vernacular. That sense of isolation and lack of opportunity have provided a foothold, allowing successively Al-Qaeda and ISIS to make inroads with those populations. Riots in the Paris banlieue of Clichy-sous-Bois foreshadowed the growing sense of alienation. It was in 2005. And French Muslims constitute upwards of 8 to 10% of France's population. So they have a very large population, and they're not happy. In Belgium, you have a very similar story. There again, you see long festering populations of Muslims who first came to Brussels in the 1970s for factory work out of North Africa, and then found themselves, when the factories closed, just basically sitting in society without any opportunities. Many returned home to Northern Africa, but many stayed and began resorting to petty crime and to drugs in the absence of legitimate work. And then, subsequently they were radicalized. You had a significant amount of Saudi investment in mosques, and they basically brought Wahhabism, a very virulent strain of conservative Islam, and that kind of intensified the alienation and the antagonism between Belgian Muslims and Belgian society. There's a likely connection between Muslim extremists then living in Brussels and the Paris bombings. So, what is that? What do you make of that? Are Muslims living in Francophone countries more vulnerable to radicalization than in Northern European countries? And what does that suggest? If you give people an opportunity, they might be more resistant to, to those kinds of appeals. The United States has additional difficulties in formulating and executing a homeland security policy. The U.S. Constitution, our status as a federal republic, and the way American federalism operates all create significant obstacles to coordinated policy related to homeland security. A significant aspect of the Department of Homeland Security's job necessarily involves coordinating the training and operations of law enforcement agencies at all three levels of government. So what are some of the problems related to domestic law enforcement and intelligence gathering that the 9/11 attacks uncovered? What counterterrorism laws were specifically crafted in the wake of 9/11? In your views, in your view, did some of those laws expanding law enforcement's ability to investigate potential terrorists overreach? Why or why not? The 2002 Department of Homeland Security Act created the latest cabinet department. Given Martin's description of DHS, how would you evaluate its institutional capacity to execute its primary mandate of protecting the homeland? Here's my hot take. DHS was cobbled together from several independent executive agencies like Immigration and Naturalization, Customs Enforcement, the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. In several instances, the Bush administration actually cut the budgets of those agencies, even as they kind of cobbled them all together, in order to forestall criticism from the right that the administration was expanding big government. Added to chronic underfunding, getting these very separate agencies on the same page took a long time, as in many instances these agencies were initially independent executive agencies with their own contracting authority, and they frequently had different and often incompatible software systems. The FBI's continued independence further undermined DHS's control over Homeland Security policy. So does this mean that I think DHS is a failed department? I think it's too soon to render that drastic a judgment, but I would say that DHS desperately needs greater levels of funding and staffing in order to enhance DHS's coordination efforts between federal, state, and local levels of government. Martin also notes the sector-specific agencies responsible for protecting certain kinds of critical infrastructure. Examples include the Department of Agriculture. Their responsibility is for food security. The Department of Defense protects DoD installations. In fact, the Department of Energy protects nuclear facilities. The Department of Health and Human Services, is designed, or their mandate in this area is healthcare systems. And the Department of Treasury is designed to try and protect the banking systems. So do these kinds of sector-specific agencies signal a desirable degree of decentralization, or are they symptomatic of kind of an undesirable balkanization of Homeland Security responsibilities? Martin also surveys the role of the intelligence community in defending the homeland. The key agencies in the intelligence community related to Homeland Security are the NSA, the CIA, the DIA, and the FBI. The NSA is the National Security Administration. The CIA, of course, is the Central Intelligence Agency. The DIA is the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is sort of like the CIA or the uniformed military. And then, of course, the FBI. Each of these agencies does something important related to domestic security. The NSA is responsible for what we call SIGINT, which are signals in intelligence. Think eavesdropping. And they have a considerable capacity to do that. And as such, they are the ones that are most likely to kind of push the envelope in terms of, civil liberties and privacy. The CIA is responsible for identifying domestic threats that originate in other countries. They are legally barred from operating within the territorial U.S., so they kind of have to coordinate with domestic law enforcement, which is difficult because there's supposed to be a wall of separation between the CIA and what happens at the domestic level. The FBI is primarily responsible for domestic intelligence collection, and they are also the primary foreign counterintelligence investigator. So the FBI has used their crime scene investigation expertise to identify culprits. They're really good at snuffing out who committed crimes and how to arrest them. They're very kind of fetishistic about pursuing chain of evidence and things like that. So what are the main challenges associated with the intelligence community's role in Homeland Security? To me, I think the problems that Martin lays out are the most significant. Serious coordination problems exist between the FBI and the CIA. These problems relate to institutional culture. The FBI is law enforcement first, and they operate according to legally prescribed rules. The CIA is intelligence focused, and they're prepared to bend the rules to give policymakers a decision advantage. And that creates this kind of tension between these two agencies, and they don't get along. They don't like one another. The last part of the chapter, in my view, is the most important. What liberties are we prepared to sacrifice on the altar of security? Martin does a good job of pointing out instances, for example, in the United Kingdom, where police took shortcuts to get to a desired end, and that is always part of the threat posed by terrorism. Martin also reminds us of many of our own failings with the Red Scares during World War I and in the Cold War, and the Japanese internment camps in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attacks. He also points to the more contemporary problem of extraordinary rendition and enhanced interrogations that took place during the Bush administrations. Today, we're seeing family separations resulting from the Trump administration's harsh attempts to discourage illegal immigration. The FBI has attempted to justify its policies by pointing to the potential that terrorists could be infiltrating caravans bringing asylum seekers to the border. What do you make of that claim? We got a lot to cover this week, and I'm sure there are some issues I haven't covered that you'll want to talk about. As always, if there's something that Martin has written or I have said that confuses you, let's hear about it. Let's talk it out in the forum. Let's have a great week.